I welcome you all this evening on the occasion of the release of our latest publication, Global Governance, Civil Society and Participatory Democracy by Nigel and Rajesh Tandon.
Thank you all for being here. I think what I'll do is I'll say a few words about FEM and then a few words about the context of the book and about the experience. It was quite, maybe I'll even start with that because it was a co-authorship between two people who like each other but don't write the same way. And so I give a lot of thanks. It was a real team effort, and a lot of thanks to those who helped both Rajesh and myself in putting this book together and giving it some kind of coherence. And it sprang out of our combined effort with FIM. FIM was formed in 1999. It was formed, Rajesh was the first chair, I was the first CEO. And it was formed with the idea of strengthening civil society's capacity to influence the United Nations. And that changed fairly rapidly as we began to realize after the year 2000 that NGOs were becoming more interested in other multilateral bodies, that the power was shifting away from the United Nations to organizations like the WTO, and the civil society was following the action. And they were concentrating their efforts more on different groups. So we began to think to ourselves, well, we need to collect all of that knowledge that's out there. We realized that there was a lot of work going on by civil society in their efforts to influence multilateralism. And we decided, amongst other things, that we'd do some case studies. We'd try to collect practitioner experience. Practitioners or activists don't very often have the time or the inclination to write about what they've done. They go from one cause to the next. They're people of action. And a lot of their experience and history is lost to those who follow them. So we decided to do case studies and try to capture the essence of practitioner knowledge. And we began with some case studies. And I remember literally thinking at the time, we'll do 4 or 5 and that will cover the whole field. That's how little was actually understood at the time about the extent to which civil society was already engaged in influencing multilateralism. I would estimate now that there are hundreds and hundreds, well, let's leave it at hundreds of interesting and highly educative instances where civil society has influenced or attempted to influence multilateralism. The activity is absolutely enormous. But we've collected up to now, after 15 years of work, over 40 revealing case studies that show what works, what doesn't work, and the kind of lessons that have been collectively learned. We've tried to do that over the years. And this became a major function of FIM. We also began what we call, and then others called quiet diplomacy. At some point, someone suggested to us, well, maybe FIM should, we need a dialogue with the G8. There's no dialogue going on with the G8. And after there was a G8 coming up, as it happened in Canada within a year, after a considerable period of negotiation, the Canadian authorities agreed to allow us to meet, to bring in people and to have a dialogue between civil society activists and leading authorities within the world, within the WTO, within the G8, which included, for that first meeting, the Canadian Sherpa. And that was the first of a series that still is ongoing, and it's now become a regular part of G8 and then subsequently G20. We also initiated the first ever G20 dialogue. So we became engaged directly on occasions, and the structure of FIM from the outset was always that to have, whatever we were engaged in, to have a majority of participants from the South. And that includes our board of directors, so that by constitution, the majority of our members was always from the South, and whenever we have any kind of a forum of any kind, we try to ensure, well, we do ensure that the majority of participants come from the South. So we bring voice of the South to the international arena, and particularly around issues of multilateralism. And then our language changed further, and as we got into this book, we began to realize how our language had changed over time. And we began speaking more and more after Iraq, I guess, we began speaking more and more of global governance. And we realized that multilateralism isn't simply about agreements amongst countries. It's becoming a form of governance. And it's a governance that's affecting every one of us in our daily lives. And it's a governance that's not democratic. It's a governance, a form of governance that's not does not involve to any significant extent elected officials or officials who are accountable back to legally accountable back to an electorate. So most parliaments throughout the world do not debate the decisions that are being taken in these multilateral arenas. So we are now, and yet, the treaties that are signed and the agreements that are made affect us all in our daily lives. And citizens don't have any direct recourse to debating or trying to influence these decisions. So the emergence of global governance, or our change of terminology, in some ways we were talking about the same thing, but we began to realize it was bigger than multilateral. It was a new form of governance. And we're actually seeing, I think in many ways, and we describe this in the book, we're actually seeing in some ways the decline of the nation state. And the huge battle that's going on now, particularly with the major powers, trying to preserve their sovereignty, but realizing more and more that in order to affect proper governance, whether it's something like Ebola or whether it's something like climate change, it can no longer be done at the nation state level. It has to be done collaboratively. And yet the forms of governance that result remain undemocratic. And that governance vacuum, or the democratic vacuum, has been filled by two main actors, in our view. One is the corporate community, and the other is civil society. And in some ways, there's a clash between the vision of what that global governance ought to take. And obviously, for civil society activists, we find ourselves trying to get a form of governance that's accountable back to an electorate. But we don't have that electorate involved right now. So our language changed once again, and the book traces the evolution of our language there as well. And we began to talk about participatory democracy. And what we're seeing around the world today, we saw it just a couple of weeks ago in Burkina Faso, is increasing determination by citizens to own their own governance. And this is we've seen obviously some very dramatic examples of that, things such as the Arab Spring, but there are many other much more subtle means in which civil society are becoming engaged directly in their own governance. And citizens, I think in general, it's fair to say, are no longer satisfied, even within democratized nations, to restrict their engagement with their own governance to a vote every 4 years. And we're embedded by modern technology. We can now react in real time. And more, there is citizens movements, ad hoc citizens movements, leaderless movements, transitory movements, where citizens become directly and immediately engaged in their own governance. And that happens obviously at the national levels, but it's also happening at the global level. And so our book is an effort to trace all of these, how these missing voices that up to now, and there remain many, but up to now, the missing voices who have not really had a direct say in their own governance, how increasingly that this is changing. And there's a decline of the nation state, there's a rise of global governance, and there's a corresponding rise of both the corporate community and citizens movements in their governance right up to the global level. So I'll leave it at that, and Rajesh will compliment me on the perspective of this book. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Nigel. Now, we'll request Nigel to kindly release the book before the author, the second author.
Oh, before?
Yeah.
I don't know that bit. Release it.
No, just release, not speak.
Oh,
Only release.
how do you do that? Sorry.
Open this up. Then we will give you a chance to speak later, once you have done the release.
You know, in South Africa, they say you can take the boy out of the township, you can't take the township out of the boy.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, Nigel, you have to stand up. Part of the photo op.
You didn't rehearse it.
Keep looking at the camera, photo op. Wonderful, thank you. Thank you. Great, great. We will give you a chance to speak. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks. Well, good evening and thank you all for joining in this very pleasant occasion. Thank you, Nigel, for introducing the Film Forum for Democratic Global Governance as well as the outlines of the book. We better not tell them all the stories, otherwise who will read the book? And thank you, Kapilaji, for your excellent support in publishing the book. And thank you all who have come here. Our purpose of releasing the book this evening was also to open a discussion about India in the future, India and the world in the future. And as Kapilaji mentioned, we thought we had done a very smart thing by getting Suresh Prabhu, who was just 3 weeks ago named as G20 Sherpa. Sherpa, for those of you who don't know, are the people who take you to Mount Everest. Now, for some reason, in the vocabulary of G8 first, G7 first, then G8, group of 7 countries, group of 8 countries, and now G20, the head of a state's personal advisor is called a Sherpa. And typically these are people who are not necessarily the Secretary of External Affairs. They are people who have retired, who are either politicians or bureaucrats or whatever. And Sherpas basically guide the head of state into the shifting sands of G20 or G8, because these sands are shifting. There is no permanent structure, there is no permanent secretariat, and they move from country to country, heads of state to heads of state, every 6 months or every year. And lately, G20 has been moving faster than G8. G8 used to have annual meeting, G20 sometimes does 2 a year, because of course there are 20 countries, so they want their turn. And that, as you know, the next week, the G20 meeting is taking place in Brisbane. And therefore, the conversation this evening, taking off from the book and taking advantage of the launch of the book, is about India and the world in the future and how we can deepen engagements in our various global alliances. So we thought we will have Suresh Prabhu as G20 Sherpa to talk about the perspective of where he sits. Prior to him, in the previous era, during Dr. Manmohan Singh's prime ministership, the then Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission, Dr. Mantek Singh Ahluwalia, remained the Sherpa with him all along. And now, since the identity of Planning Commission is in question, and there is no Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission, there is no automatic handing over. We also thought that we will have Nitin Desai, who has been former Undersecretary in the UN and has been involved in a number of UN-related development initiatives. But he has been appointed to be a member of Prime Minister Advisory Council on Climate Change. And that meeting is taking place right now because Prime Minister is going to Brisbane. And first meeting of Climate Change Committee is important to guide the climate change strategy. It's good that we have such allies and we can take the conversation from this evening to their notice as and when we feel it's appropriate. So thank you all. Let me start by positioning from our vantage point what we see are some of the opportunities and challenges for India in the world of tomorrow. India is the largest democracy in the world. It is the second largest population in the world. And it is the third largest economy in the world on purchasing power parity basis. 1, 2, 3. In 1950s, under the leadership of then Prime Minister of India, principles of South-South cooperation and Bandung Declaration were made. And for many decades, India was in the forefront of the non-aligned movement, support to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and many places around the world. But we are concerned, I am particularly concerned that in the last maybe 20 years, 25 years, we have not been able to maintain the kind of global leadership that India used to provide earlier. Of course, India's IT industry is known globally. We have a large diaspora. Many of them have been elected governors in the United States lately. And I'm told that Governor of South Carolina is visiting Delhi this week or something like that. I don't know if you're hosting a party or dinner, Kavita, but don't forget us to. And in the course of the last 2 decades, there has been much attention given to India, not just as a country of poverty, but also rising India, emergent India, shining India, etc., etc. But from the vantage point of the civil society organizations, from the vantage point of development organizations, many a times we have come across a disconnect. Take the case of Millennium Development Goals. They were signed, and hopefully they will be delivered next year. But within India, in India's parliament, or in India's large municipal corporations, there was no conversation of what is MDG, who is supposed to implement. On each of those 7 goals, forget the 8th one, each of the first 7 goals, India's own benchmarks and targets were far ahead of what was committed. But commitments were made in New York and no conversation domestically. Since 1985, we have had a structure of dialogue between NGOs, voluntary organizations, and governments at all levels. The former Prime Minister, late Rajiv Gandhi, former Prime Minister, late Narasimha Rao, former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, former Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, they have convened dialogues at the highest level with development organizations, and several of you have attended that. I have had privilege to attend most of them in my career. But what pained us, that while these structures of dialogue and even a policy, national policy on voluntary organization is being made domestically, India's representative in the United Nations rejects the recommendations of the Cardoso panel in November 2004. And in fact, India seems to stand next to Cuba, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. We were surprised that a progressive relationship that exists domestically between the government of India and NGOs, development organizations, was not being reflected in its global manifestation. And while my friends in South Africa and Brazil have been hosting all international conferences in the last 2 decades, we haven't had that privilege in this country. The last international conference of any substance, multilateral international conference, was when we see the pictures, late Prime Minister Indira Gandhi giving a bear hug to Castro. And that must have been 1983 or something like that, in Vigyan Bhavan. International conferences on, forget Civicus. So many times I was the former chair of Civicus. I wanted to host Civicus Assembly in India. But there was no space or recognition for bringing these practitioners of development from around the world to India to showcase India's experience. The last international sociological conference where Paulo Freire came was in 1982-83. So the point I am making is that the rest of the world is looking up to India. We have practical experience on the base. Our not just IT professionals and not just certain business houses are known internationally, but around the world people are looking at India's experience on creating practical development solutions in poverty entrenched and excluded communities. Don't forget India Mark II hand pump, which UNICEF propagated in sub-Saharan Africa, was invented, designed by NGOs in Maharashtra during the time of the drought there. The microfinance practices of India, Indian Development Organization. The local government and women's leadership in panchayats. People are thirsting to learn about these models, but we haven't had the kind of opportunity because in some ways we did not in India in the last 20-25 years as a government, as a country, as a society to relate to the rest of the world. Even today, when a professional practitioner of a development organization attends an international conference, my relatives say, you're going on a junket. But when he, as a businessman, goes to Europe, he's going for trade deals. This kind of a disconnect is something that I wanted to share with you because I believe that times are changing. India's median age is 24 years. Half of our population, 630 million Indians are below the age of 24 years today. And we have 900 million mobile connections. So more people have access to mobile than to toilets. The youth of India is already a global citizen. The business of India is becoming globalized. The educational systems of India are becoming globalized. So we need to create thick and multifaceted global relationships around the world. And we need to reposition thinking inside India that having global connections is okay. I am very happy to see that our new government, under the leadership of the new Prime Minister, is asserting that global role. He has already traveled to many places. In his inauguration, he invited heads of state from South Asia, which I thought was a very good gesture, living in peace in the neighborhood. And I'm quite aware that there are going to be increasing economic and trade relationships. But I want to position in that in terms of standing in the world, in terms of economic standing in the world, India is only third. In terms of demography, we are second, and in terms of democracy, we are first. So our global relationship should not only be positioned on economy, it could also be positioned on the new youth of India as well as the democratic stirrings and practices in India. So, spaces like G20, spaces like BRICS, spaces like IPSA are being created. They are opportunities for deeper engagement of Indian society and not just Indian government at the national level. I am quite aware of the fact that Singapore has more officers in their embassies around the world than India has. Our investment in Ministry of External Affairs and its capacities has been weak. I am delighted to have Mr. Kumar Tuhin present here. He is Joint Secretary in Ministry of External Affairs, Development Partnership Administration. For the last 2 years, we are working together to explore, and he is committed to explore how Indian NGOs can partner with Indian government in its programs and initiatives globally, particularly in Asia and in Africa. Several of you have been involved in many of those networks, but I think time has come for us to think about how we can take this conversation, not within our narrow sectors of government to government or NGO to NGO or business to business, because those conversations anyway have been going on, but to spread them and have conversations and linkages across sectors as we relate not only domestically but also globally. Domestically, all of us sit together and have a dialogue, meaningful exchange. We disagree, but we work together. But beyond India's borders, that is yet to happen. That is yet to be realized. And I believe that India can play a very significant role, not just as a developing economy, but as a country where experiences, practices, institutions have had a sense of livability, harmony with the rest of the world. And I know, as many of you know from your own experience, that not only development organizations of other countries, but even students, youth, government officials, local government leaders, academics, business people of other countries also want to learn from India, engage India in a horizontal manner, not just engage with Indian representatives in New York or Geneva or Paris, where our multilateral institutions are. I know that G20 is a place where heads of states of 20 largest countries sit together, but I think Indian leadership in G20 should raise the call for democratization. Democratization of global governance, the kind of call that Nigel was giving, and the kind of examples or illustrations that we have produced in this book. When we were discussing these ideas of global governance with our colleagues from the Arab world, from societies with predominantly Muslim religious communities, way before Arab Spring or anything, the one thing they said consistently, we don't have faith in multilateral institutions as they are currently constructed, because these multilateral institutions are beholden to the dominant powers of the world. They are beholden to G1, G7, G8, etc. And they said that why can't we create multilateralism of the South? Why can't we create relationships across similar countries and similar initiatives, but not just limit ourselves to the United Nations system? Because in the United Nations system, we the peoples, as part of its charter, is yet to be realized. It continues to be we the governments, elected or otherwise. So I hope that not only the conversation this evening, but our thinking together over the coming period would help us to work together with our government, with our Ministry of External Affairs, with our embassies and ambassadors, in a way to begin to articulate or create a new path which is more inclusive, more horizontal, and more South-South based for India's unique position in the world of tomorrow. Thank you.